Welcome to my presentation about the relationships between museums and Native Americans, a case study of the Natural History Museum of Utah. So, my name is Candace Bryan. I'm an anthropology honors student at the Department of Anthropology at University of Utah. My thesis mentor is Dr. Elizabeth Archuleta. I would like to start off with the land acknowledgement because land is a really important issue for Native American people because we are living on their land. So I live on Eastern Shoshone land and Goshu land, and the University of Utah campus and Natural History Museum of Utah sits on Eastern Shoshone land. So to get started with this presentation, I needed to understand how museums came to be, and doing that, I had to understand expositions and fairs. Specifically, I focused on the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. So in the middle here, you see a picture of the ethnology building. And this ethnology building had thousands of pieces from many, many native tribes across the United States of America, but then also in other countries. So the reasoning why they had all this stuff is because the goals of expositions back in the day were to allow people to think about Western society as progressive and that they were innovative and that they were going into the future. So at these expositions, they had inventions, they had new ideas, they had all these Western society signs of progress. But then they also had these exhibits with primitive peoples that they believed to be not progressive, not continuing into the modern society. And this was basically a showing of these people are going to be going extinct because of their lifestyles and because of how they live. And this was also not great. It wasn't a great exposition. This building wasn't great because of the way that they put together the cultural material of these tribes. Because they made it homogeneous. There was no distinction between tribes or areas. It was just all homogeneous. So it seemed like there wasn't any diversity between Native American peoples, which is false. And another thing that they did was make it seem like they weren't going to be around and they were going to go extinct. So that's an important idea for the future of museums. So the two people who created this exhibit specifically were these two men on the left. So on the top left corner is Frederick Putnam, and he was the Peabody Museum curator, and he basically curated this exhibit. On the bottom left is Franz Boas, who is known as the father of modern anthropology, and he helped do this exhibit as well. So obviously two very influential anthropologists who also continued their careers into museums and influenced the creation of museums in the United States. Thankfully, there was Native American activism at this exposition because this exposition was held on Simon Pokagon's land, who is an indigenous person. So he wanted to be a part of the exposition, so he got to do a speech, ring a bell to start the exposition, but then he also sold the speech called The Red Man's Rebuke, which was basically a critique on Western society and how the United States didn't have any authority over Native American people in their land, but then also that white people would be taken away from this earth because they have destroyed their land. They've destroyed the United States. So this was just the beginning of Native American activism going against these Western ideas, because after decades of Native American activism, Native American people finally got to change how museums created exhibits and depicted them. So one of the early examples of collaboration between Native American people and museums is at the Denver Museum for their Crane Hall, which is just about Native American people across the United States. So one of the pieces of this exhibit was the Cheyenne diorama. Usually dioramas aren't that great, but this one was different because it was collaborated on with Cheyenne people from Denver. So on this far right corner upper corner, we have Richard Talbot on the left, and he's showing the sculptor for this diorama how this process of making this piece works, but then also giving her a model so that she can accurately depict him in this diorama on the left upper corner. These other models were also modeled off of people who were Cheyenne in Denver. So this was done by a lot of collaboration and was created with Native American people, so that's great. And they also had a contemporary exhibit going with this, talking about issues that affect Native American people in Denver. So having that continuation from a historical context of Native American people, but then also showing that they're still here and they still have issues that people should be educated about, is an important continuation to show that Native American people are still here. They're not stagnant, they're not primitive, they're continuing on with their culture, but just in the modern day. So one of the other Native American interpretations of museums is tribal museums, which is basically just a museum run by a tribe. One of those that is really great is the Maka Cultural and Research Center. And this tribe has one of the biggest collections of their own cultural material of any other tribal museum, one of the biggest. So that's one example of a tribal museum. Another really cool example of Native American people getting back their culture from these museums is this picture on the bottom right corner of the Mohican people getting back the powder horn of John Quinney, who is a Mohican ancestor who is really important to them, from the Oshkosh Museum. So they applied for repatriation through the Native American Graves and Protections Act, which basically allows Native American people to get back bodies and the remains and the cultural matrimony, the cultural materials of their people. So that's just one of the examples of that, and actually it just happened a couple days ago. So the work is continuing on to this day. So getting into the case study for the Natural History Museum of Utah, I specifically looked at their Native Voices exhibit. And these are just some of the things that the exhibit does really well. They continue this pattern of past and present, how modern continues on with the past and their culture. So, for example, on the left corner, upper corner, there is this picture book of a Shoshone tale, which is a modern interpretation through a picture book, because usually stories and history is told orally. So this was shown with a bunch of other pieces that were historical, but then also made in the modern day. So this is an example of making sure that the material that's shown of Native American people, that represent Native American people, is not only historical, but also from a modern context, because they're still here. So then on the upper right corner, we have a quote from Charlotte Lomelli. Our culture, our way of life today, and our future all come together by our oral history, written and presented by our people for other nations to see and remember the Paiutes. We are still here and we remember. So that represents an idea in this exhibit that Native American people have existed and they still exist, and they just want people to understand their experiences and their culture through their perspectives. So that's an important piece of this exhibit. On the bottom left corner is the entrance to this museum, or this exhibit, where pictures of the elders of different tribes are in your perspective as you walk in. And then there's also a speaker that allows them to welcome you into the space. And then as you're exiting, you see the younger generation on the other side as you're exiting. So it's this idea that the older generation is welcoming people into their culture and welcoming people to learn, but then they're also teaching their culture and their history and their experiences to the young people, and it's continuing into the future. So on the bottom right corner, we have a picture of the glass display in this exhibit. And this is important because glass displays have always been an issue, even back with expositions, because like we said, it made it homogenous because there wasn't any differentiation between tribes, and it just made it seem not diverse. Native American people were stagnant, and that was just one people. With this glass display, they make sure that each section is by tribe. So each tribe has their section, and they have their own materials, and they show off their own culture and their own experiences in these glass displays. So those are just some of the great things that this exhibit does. But there are some improvements that could be done to make this exhibit even better and allow people to see it even more. Because one of the issues with the exhibit is that it's on the top floor of the exhibit in the corner. And that is the picture that I have in the middle with the glass doors. That is the Native Voices exhibit. And there isn't much signage, and there isn't many ways to get there easily, because from the 4th floor you have to take stairs or the elevator, and usually people start on the bottom floor, so it's hard to get to this exhibit unless you start from the 5th floor, but then there's still not much signage saying that there's anything on this floor. So that is one thing that they could do, is make sure that there's signage, make sure that people understand that this is an exhibit that they can go into. Because of the doors, that's kind of different. But then also there's no signage next to this exhibit, making sure people understand that this is an exhibit. Because all the other exhibits in this museum have very large signage, like this sky sign on the right, showing the sky exhibit on that floor. But for Native Voices, it's all inside of these glass doors, so there's no indication of this exhibit outside of these glass doors. Another problem with this exhibit that I saw was a lack of context for many events or issues, because a lot of these Native American events and traumas in the past continue on into the present. And so making sure that people understand that context of that continuation of history and loss of culture and trauma is really important to the Native American history. But then also it's important to understanding contemporary issues. So one of the examples is about this quote on the top left corner about the Bear River Massacre by Bruce Perry, who's Western Shoshone. And he talks about the Bear River Massacre. It was a horrible, horrible event. And there is a paragraph talking about the event a little bit further. And there are other quotes that throughout this whole exhibit is just quotes from Native American people about different events and issues. But none of it is contextualized, none of it is connected to each other. So there's unfortunate events, there's unfortunate circumstances, but they're not all connected with the idea, with Native American history and why Native American people were in these unfortunate events. And the issues that they face now are connected to the past. So on the bottom left is a quote about boarding schools from Glenn Rogers, who's Paiute, and that is also another traumatic experience that Native American people went through that is also has to be contextualized so that people understand the history even more clearer, and that Native American people, when they come to this exhibit, understand that all these things are connected and that all these things aren't just singular events that don't affect other people in the future because they know they affect them in the future. But the public needs to understand that, because if they don't understand the history, they'll lose that interpretation and that perspective. So those are just some of the improvements that the Natural History Museum of Utah could make. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for coming. This work was supported by funding from the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program at the University of Utah. And I would like to thank my thesis mentor, Dr. Archuleta, for being the best mentor and super great. Thank you for coming.